Hello, everybody. I'm a lawyer in private practice, located in Portland, Oregon, in the United States. Some of you may recognize my name. I'm a relatively frequent commenter on the OSI license mailing lists. Otherwise, I'm heavily involved in a lot of initiatives around open source and the law, which I'll talk about a little bit about later. But today's presentation is sort of my random thoughts about things related to the law and open source as a result of having been working in this area for pretty much close to 20 years. I know I've been involved with OSI for maybe 18 years in various capacities, so have seen a lot of stuff come and go over the years. Just had a couple of thoughts I'd throw down here, and things that I think are semi-provocative or things you may not have thought about, some of this stuff is fairly elementary, but let's get into it. So I'm a lawyer. You've had a lot of lawyers talking today. There's a little bit of legal content in here, but not a whole lot. It's much more kind of philosophy and thinking through kind of how legal issues interact with some of the issues that those of you who aren't lawyers have to deal with. And there's no charge here for my 4.41 billable hours that I'm giving in this presentation. So I've got 7 lessons here I'm going to talk through. Some of these I think will be axiomatic to a lot of you. Some of them are more kind of my musings on things that I think you may want to think about, or you may want to ask your lawyers to think about at some point. So lesson number 1. I'm actually going to reiterate a presentation that was supposed to follow me but isn't, which is Simon Phipps's presentation that he was supposed to do at 12:30 today. The topic of his presentation was Speak to a Lawyer Second. Simon, as with many things, is absolutely correct on that point, and I agree fully with him, despite the fact that I'm a lawyer. When you're thinking about your open source decisions, you really need to have your business and community strategy figured out first. Once you do that is when you may want to engage with your legal. If you're doing it in the reverse, if you're going to the lawyer first and saying, hey, explain to me all the legal stuff, and then we'll figure out a business or community strategy after that, that's really not the right way to do it. You get yourself into trouble when you do that because you really haven't thought through your strategy in a comprehensive way. Your lawyer can help you with the strategy, but really your lawyer shouldn't be the one driving your strategy. And what you want to do before you go to your lawyer is think through some of the basic questions about your strategy. Who are your users? Who are your contributors? What do you want your users to do? What do you not want your users to do? Why are you picking a particular strategy? What is your end game with that strategy? And how do you want people who get access to your code to behave or not behave? These are some fundamental questions that you kind of need to ask yourself at the outset. And once you've penciled those in, or once you've figured out what the answers to those questions are, then is a good time to go talk to a lawyer about what are the best ways to effectuate that strategy, not the other way around. Okay, so I think that's what Simon would have said if he'd have given a presentation after me. And I apologize in advance if somehow I misrepresented what Simon would have told you. And by the way, I think Simon would have said, you need to talk to somebody who's got a good community engagement skills, knows about open source strategy. Somebody like Simon, for example, would be a good person to hire for answering these sorts of questions or talking through these sort of questions with you. Okay, so that's lesson number 1. Lesson number 2. Do you even need a lawyer? Now, it's kind of a little bit surprising that you would have a lawyer come on here and ask you whether you even need a lawyer in the first instance, but it is a question that a lot of people ask themselves and sometimes decide that they don't. And sometimes that's a good decision, and sometimes that's a bad decision. It really depends in answering that question upon a lot of different factors. So what's the size of the community that you'll be serving? What are the financial stakes that are going to be involved in the project that you're working on and the legal decisions that go with that? What's the license that you're choosing for your project, and what your contribution policies are? Each of these questions may drive your need for some legal advice after you figured out your strategy. And the more complicated these questions are, or the more nuanced they are, or the bigger financial stakes that are involved, the more it behooves you to take advantage of legal advice that may help you think through some of the consequences of the decisions that you want to make for your project. Now, for the people who don't want to engage a lawyer because the stakes are too low, or they think they're going to use a fairly standard license and they don't think there's going to be a lot of controversy about how the code is used, there are resources available to you where you can get some legal guidance for your decisions and some understanding of the legal issues that may be involved in the decisions that you are making. I highlight here 4 books. Some of these are actually available for free. And I think you may know some of the names here. So Larry Rosen wrote his book many years ago and was involved with the OSI for many years. Heather and Van Lindenberg's books are relatively new. And Heather's is much more kind of a business-driven decision. Van's is much more of a legal issues-driven thing. But again, they both address the topics adequately. The book on the right-hand side is not yet available, has been pointed out in the chat room. The only reason I mention that, it is coming out sometimes, I think, by the end of the year. That book it's by Oxford University Press, and it is much less USA-centric than some of the other books. A lot of the stuff that's written for legal audiences in open source is extremely USA-centric law. The Oxford University book is a little bit more international focused, so you get a lot of discussion about decisions in, say, the UK and Europe, which may be helpful for some of those of you who are outside the United States. Full disclosure, I wrote a couple of chapters in the book on the far right, the Oxford University book, so take that as you may. So if you're deciding not to engage a lawyer, I'd encourage you to take a look at the OSI list. There's a list of licenses that are called popular and widely used or with strong community licenses. Those really are the bulk of the licenses that are used in open source licensing around the world. I think it represents something like 85% of the open source code out there. Those may be good choices for you if you want to forego the services of a lawyer, or you want to only rely on the books that I mentioned before. In fact, the books that I mentioned before will be focused primarily on those sorts of licenses, the ones in the popular and widely used or strong community list on the OSI. Now, that doesn't mean that those licenses are the best for your particular circumstance. Other licenses on the list, based on your development model, based on your business plan, may be a better choice than those. So you do need to think about that if there are some unusual aspects to your community engagement in your business plan. It really depends on what your goals are, making decisions about which licenses to choose. Now, the 2 most dangerous words in open source are, it's actually more than 2 words, but one of them is abbreviated. I am not a lawyer, but you see this a lot on mailing lists, message boards, etc. There are many people who are not lawyers who are very knowledgeable about legal issues. There are many people on mailing lists and message boards who don't know what they're talking about, but nevertheless give opinions that sound like legal opinions. Be careful of that. I would suggest that you verify anything that people say on message boards to make sure they comport with, say, for example, the stuff in the books that I referred you to before. Don't rely on somebody who says they're not a lawyer, but they know exactly how a license works or how the courts will decide a particular decision. They may, in fact, be quite wrong. Okay, lesson 3. Just because everybody else is doing it one way doesn't mean that you should too. So there are numerous debates within the open source world about how to do things or the right way to do things, but that may not be the right issue for you. I think most of you are aware of the debate between copyleft licenses and non-copyleft licenses, or often the terminology used is permissive or BSD type licenses or Apache type licenses. There's also the debate amongst copyleft licenses, which is the GPL family of licenses or the other copyleft licenses that are non-GPL. There certainly is a vigorous debate about contribution policies, and that's going on right now between whether copyright assignment is appropriate, whether a contributor license agreement is appropriate, or whether just a developer certificate of origin is appropriate. Another debate, although it's not too frequent, but it may become that way soon, is the licenses that require attribution versus the zero version of licenses that don't. Again, all of these are debates that go on philosophically among people who are in the open source world. There are advocates for all of these positions, and there are detractors of all of these positions. And you can see those debates ongoing in message boards, etc., all the time. You really need to decide which of these is best for you based on your usage model, your contribution model, your business plan if you have one, and decide what's right for you. Okay, next lesson. You have a lot of choices available to you, and I would argue that possibly you have too many. So I put together a little chart here. This is based on some Wayback Machine archaeological excavation of the number of licenses listed on the OSI list over the years, starting from 98 to the present. As you can see, there was a huge slope up until about 2004, and then it sort of leveled out and actually dipped down a little bit for some reason in the mid-teens and has steadily gone up after that. We're at the point now where we're about to hit 100 different licenses on the OSI list. Looks like that would probably happen by 2025. Whether or not that's a good or a bad thing is an interesting debate to have. Part of the problem, in my opinion, is the more choices that you have, the more opportunities you have to make mistakes in choosing your license, the more that you may need skilled advice in navigating which license does or doesn't work for what you want to do, and the more need for tools and processes to sort through all of this. So things like OpenChain, like SPDX, like scanning tools become more and more sort of a critical part of your infrastructure. The more licenses there are out there, the more differing terms these licenses has, the more incompatibility there are between licenses. It's harder and harder to sort of do your own lawyering when you have so many different choices. So whether or not that's a problem that needs to be solved, you'll get different opinions on that, but it's something to think about, all the choices you have and whether that's creating problems for you in making decisions. Okay, next lesson. You probably have a favorite license, and it probably has flaws. There really is no platonic ideal open source license. Even some of the most famous and most frequently used licenses that have been drafted during multi-year, multi-stakeholder processes still can have ambiguities in them or debatable issues in them. That includes some of the licenses on the OSI approved list. If you follow the OSI mailing lists regularly, you will see these debates happen in real time, where people will say, well, there's some ambiguity about this particular clause in the license, but on the whole, I think it's approvable as it's consistent with the OSI requirements for approval. But lawyers, those of us who practice in this area a lot, have looked at these licenses in detail, know that each of them have things where we are less comfortable with the way that they are written, or have questions about the way that they would be interpreted if they were ever attempted to be enforced. I will say that the more obscure licenses, the older licenses, the licenses that were single drafter generated, the ones that may have been drafted without the benefit of a lawyer, tend to be the ones that have the higher likelihood of having problems with the way that they are drafted. But that's not always the case. You know, it's possible that some of the older licenses are actually generally pretty good for their time, even ones that may not have been drafted without the benefit of a lawyer. And of course, the interesting issue here is not everybody agrees on these licenses. So lawyer A will say, by gosh, this particular clause is so ambiguous, it ought to be interpreted in way X, and another lawyer will say, no, I don't think that's an appropriate interpretation. It ought to be interpreted as Y. And we lawyers like to have these sorts of debates about the ways that licenses should be interpreted and how they might be construed if they were ever litigated in a particular jurisdiction. Okay, lesson number 6. Open source lawyering is quite a bit different than the way typical lawyers do their job. So on the left here is my representation of how regular lawyering happens. It's a little out of date, but you know, you think of the lawyer with a big giant bookshelf full of books, the lawyer sifting through that to figure out what the state of the law is and making an opinion. You don't get to do a whole lot of that in open source lawyering. You're much more looking to things like FAQs, message boards, and mailing lists to determine what people think about the way licenses should be construed, what's the underlying philosophy of a particular license, to determine how to come to some conclusions about how a license or other legal document in open source should work. So open source lawyering is sort of an amalgam of a lot of different things. The regular lawyering, so looking through case law or statutory law to the extent that it's findable and relevant to a particular license. Understanding what community consensus is around a license through message boards and FAQs. Some degree of technology consulting, so understanding how pieces of software work with one another and how that may relate to the way that licenses work and are constructed. Some degree of philosophical analysis. So what is the philosophy behind a particular license? What do the people who wrote it want it to do? And would a particular way of using it go for or against that philosophy? And predictive analytics, which is part of lawyering in almost every case, which is to say, okay, I don't know what the law on this is particularly because we don't have any binding case law. What do I think based on the closest that we have would be the result? So that's kind of how we open source lawyers do our job. It's a lot more complicated and different than the way that typical lawyers do their job. Okay, lesson 7, final lesson here. Many of the most interesting legal questions in open source are completely unanswered. I've got a couple of examples here of questions that we lawyers debate all the time that are yet to be fully resolved. Patents and certain licenses. So there's a long ongoing debate, and you will see this on the license message boards about patent rights and whether a particular license does or does not confer patent rights with it? And if so, what is the scope of those patent rights? That's still very much a unresolved issue that may never be resolved. It still may be a pending issue for many of these licenses. What is a derivative work? I think most of you know that derivative works is a term in the US copyright law, and it's very relevant to construction of a lot of the copyleft licenses. But understanding how to determine whether something is a derivative work or not is very complicated analysis, particularly since the courts are not exactly clear or consistent in the way that you do that. So that's always been an open question. The use of APIs. I think many of you are familiar with the decision in Google Oracle, and you think, well, that resolved the API issue completely. Well, not really. It's still somewhat unclear on that point, although I think a lot of lawyers have made the conclusions that for the most part, uses of APIs is probably going to be okay without having to abide by the copyright license attached to it. But it's not entirely shut the door on that question. Putting restrictions on top of open source code, you'd probably think, oh, that's impermissible. But there have been a couple of cases floating around recently that talk about this. There was one that came out in China a couple of weeks ago that addressed this question squarely. Another case that many of you probably thought was resolved a long time ago, SCO versus IBM, is actually not yet completely resolved. And there was actually a claim in that case about SCO's attempt to impose fees or use restrictions on top of code that was GPL. I don't think that's ultimately going to get resolved by a court because it looks like that case is going to be settled, but it's one of these questions that sort of floats around but has never gotten resolved. What is non-compliance? I think some of you may be familiar that there were some activities in Germany over several years where claims of non-compliance were being made against people where there was a debate about whether it was truly non-compliance or not. So you get these kind of questions popping up occasionally. Sometimes they get resolved, sometimes they don't. But there are a lot of these questions that we lawyers still don't know what the definitive answer is. And the one place or one of the places where these sort of discussions are had at a very high level and a very detailed level is one of the things that I'm involved in. It's called Jolts, Journal of Open Law, Technology and Society, or jolts.world. This is a place where lawyers and other folks come in and do detailed analyses of issues like the ones I talked about before that may not yet be resolved definitively, and kind of give our take on how we think it ought to be resolved, or address the questions that continue to be unresolved. So for those of you who are lawyers, it's a good resource to look up to see what people are writing about on these particular issues. For those of you who are not lawyers, it's still worth taking a look at because you can sort of see a summary of some of the issues that are of interest to people who dive deep into legal issues around open source. Okay, so that's all I've got for you today. We've got a couple of minutes for questions. So feel free to pop them into the chat or unmute and throw them my way.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Let's give McCoy a nice warm round of applause. And as he said, if there are any questions or folks would like to add a comment, please, by all means, use the public chat. That's what it's here for. We see a lot of clapping, a lot of thank you, a lot of nicely done. I'm sure you can see that too, but for our friends who aren't watching the chat, maybe on the phone.
Anyway, if you have questions about this, since we're running low on time, feel free to drop me a email. My email address is mccoy, so McCoy, my first name, at lexpan.law. It's fairly simple to remember. Otherwise, thank you very much for your time, and I hope this was useful.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much, McCoy. One more time, thank you. All right, I believe this is the last session here in the law room for the day. So there's still about a half hour left in the other room, which schedule is, pardon me for 1 second. The Ensuring Diversity in the Workplace session is in Academia and Beyond, and that will be continuing for another 30 minutes or so. Otherwise, thank you, McCoy. Thank you to all the speakers and moderators and volunteers who've been helping to keep the wheels on the wagon today. Definitely appreciate all of your contributions. Stick around here if you would like to talk law and legal stuff. Otherwise, we'll see you in the Academia and Beyond room. And thank you to our sponsors one more time. I might as well read them off because, yes, thank you very much. We couldn't do it without you. Open Source Initiative, Red Hat, Google, Reblaze, Collabora, Apereo, GNOME, FreeBSD Foundation, and Blindside. Thank you all very much for being here today, and we'll see you next time. My name is Remy.